We're going to look at, in part one here this morning, we're going to look at worldview. We're going to look at evolution and the issue of fossils. It's very difficult for me to decide what order should I put all these different topics that we're going to be looking at in 3 different sessions this morning. But I wanted to start with a way to see the difference between an evolutionary perspective and a biblical perspective. In this case, you notice there, I'm going to point out to you, turn to page 3, you'll see it's always bad teaching methodology to tell people to read a book while you're speaking. I don't want you to necessarily read in your book, but at least it allows you to confirm what you're seeing on the screen. And you're going to have more materials in your book that you're taking home with you than you will get this morning. I cannot possibly cover everything that I have in there. Let's look at origins now from the viewpoint of worldview. Once there was absolutely nothing, and then there was something. If anyone here knows how to make that happen, you will become very rich and very famous, because no one knows how to do that. That is basically inexplicable, to start with nothing and get something. So we have 2 other options of origins. Everything began with an eternal, impersonal matter. We call that naturalistic evolution. Or the other option, everything began with an eternal, intelligent, personal being. We call that intelligent design, or if you wish, creation. Those are the 2 issues that we are looking at this morning and trying to determine the difference between them and where we each stand. Everything, everybody, in other words, as I pointed out those origins, everyone starts with something. If you went into the Bible, you'll find in the very first verse, in the beginning, what? God. In the beginning, God. But in the naturalistic evolution, your first verse in your Genesis is, in the beginning, matter. That's the difference. It's a difference in point of view of where you start. And so the question I ask, can matter create a mind, or is it a mind that creates matter? And it makes more sense intuitively to consider that a mind was the source of matter than the other way around. But let's take those 2 positions. In the beginning, matter. Well, at that point then, all you have is non-living, no mind, impersonal. In other words, what we need to get in the real world that we live in is you have to get life. You have to get persons with minds. How are we going to do that? Well, according to this position, you're going to throw the dice. You're going to operate on the basis of chance, with no direction, no guidance, no mind, nothing there except non-living matter. Call it dirt if you'd like. The periodic chart of the elements. And by chance, that's going to generate life. It's going to generate persons with minds. That's the position of naturalistic evolution. Here's a text. One of the great wonders of our existence and of life itself is that it has risen through a combination of evolutionary processes and chance events, right straight out of a biology textbook used in school. Acknowledging the chance nature of it. Let's go the other side. In the beginning, God. We'll start there this time. Now notice, you already have life in existence. You already have a person in existence. You already have a mind in existence. And it's from that life and that person and that mind you get additional life, not by dice, not by chance, but by intelligent design, in which you now have exactly the same supposed result: life, persons, and mind. But it came from a life, a person, and a mind. A significant difference. Would you agree with me? Huge difference. And even intuitively, without even studying the scientific evidence for these, you would say, it looks like that would make more sense. God says it that way. It is I who made the earth and created man upon it. I stretched out the heavens with my hands. I ordained all their host. Isaiah 45:12. All I'm going to do this morning as I go through the different sessions is show you that the evidence from the world is actually in an agreement with the evidence from the Word. of God. Let's move from that worldview, in the beginning matter, operating on the basis of chance, let's move into the idea of an understanding of what Darwin actually proposed. On page 9 of your book, you'll have some reference to, not Darwin, but to his ideas. Charles Darwin usually gets most of the blame for everything that has happened in the area of evolution, though I think Darwin himself was much more cautious than our position in science today. Here's what he saw, and here's what conclusion he came to. First, organisms exhibit variability due to the creation and subsequent random mutation. No one here should argue with that observation of Darwin. Organisms, including humans, all have variability. Now today we know from the understanding of genetics, we even know where that variability comes from. So that's an observation we don't have to argue about. These variations can be inherited. At the time of Darwin, he didn't have genetics. They didn't know about genetics. And so it was only later that we discovered that he was right in his observation. It doesn't take a genius to figure out that your kids look more like you than they do somebody else. There's an inheritance of the characteristics, and he made that observation. Thirdly, organisms reproduce many more offspring than can survive. And we know that from the study of many, many things, that there is overpopulation from the point of view of insects to bacteria to most anything. They have the capability of reproducing far more than what could possibly survive in the world. The environment, he said, actually determines which individuals are capable of surviving. Those that have the better survival characteristics for given environmental conditions are going to leave more offspring than those who do not seem to have the right characteristics for survival. Therefore, those characteristics of the survivors are passed on to the next generation. That's called survival of the fittest, a key concept that Darwin proposed. I don't think I have so much argument with Darwin on these observations. He came to the conclusion all living organisms are subjected to competition for existence. Those organisms with the characteristics that favor survival in a particular environment will live. Let's pretend that as it came in this morning in one of these walls here, there was, my goodness, the whole wall is covered with houseflies. And somebody quickly runs and finds a sprayer with chemicals in it, and he sprays down the wall, and they drop like flies. But not all of them. The flies aren't all identical. Some of them have characteristics that are resistant to the particular chemical that was sprayed on them. But we're pretty happy that most of them are dead now. Next week we come back, and there's flies on the wall again. And we get the sprayer out and spray the chemical on them. This time, fewer of them fall. And if we keep going week after week and we use the same chemical, pretty soon we have houseflies on the wall that are not they're not responding. We know the same concept with the use of antibiotics, where overuse of antibiotics can result in killing the bacteria that don't have the characteristics for survival in the presence of that antibiotic. Eventually, you kill off all those that are sensitive to it, and you get a strain of bacteria that are resistant to that particular chemical. There are a number of applications like that, and that's a description of what Darwin called natural selection. The environment, whatever the circumstance, it might not be a spray, it might be temperature, it might be some other factor, will determine which organisms live and which ones die. And he called that natural selection. Examples that he used of that was like the finches on the Galapagos Islands. in which when prosperity of rainfall came to the islands, there was lots of new seeds and food for the birds, the finches, and as a result, the finches' beaks had a tendency to become smaller because they were better designed for picking out the small new seeds that were growing in the plants on the island. But when drought came, there were no new seeds. Only the old dried ones that survived and was laying on the ground. And so in order to crack those open and use them for food, they needed tougher beaks. And so the birds, the finches that had the stronger beaks seemed to become the predominant ones on the island. What they fail to point out, and this is often pointed out in evolutionary literature, this is an example of evolution. Depends on what you mean by evolution. There are two views we're going to look at in just a moment. It fails to point out that as a result of whether drought or as a result of rain, there was no net gain. They went from the smaller beak to the larger beak to the smaller beak, depending on environmental circumstances. Don't forget that finch in the larger picture of evolution has to become a camel. It has to become a people. We're not talking about size and shape of beaks. That might illustrate natural selection, but the concept of evolution on a macro level is to take those small changes and assume that you can pile them up until you have big changes. That's the part of science which is not demonstrated. Another example students will identify and recognize with this is the peppered moth. It's often used as an illustration. Years ago in England, they had trees that would be a normal bark color, and moths existed in a dark and a light variety. While the normal trees, if you look at that trunk, you can notice that the dark one stands out against the normal trunk bark. The light one is somewhat camouflaged. Can you even find it on the tree trunk? Birds like moths, and so they come flying by, and guess which ones they're going to see and eat? Well, the dark one. And so the population between the light and the dark favor the light one, and so that's the majority of the population of the moths. Until pollution began to come into play in England, and the tree trunks began to darken. And then all of a sudden, it was the dark one that was camouflaged, and it was the white one that was visible. And sure enough, the populations, they claimed, changed, so that now the dark one became the predominant numbers, and the white one became the fewer numbers. You see, that's evolution in progress. Because what you're doing is illustrating natural selection, but you're not illustrating macroevolution. That's a huge jump. After the tree trunks began to recover, after some pollution issues were dealt with, they were about equally exposed, and the result was the population became somewhat equal. But again, we're not talking about every one of you sitting here, if I said evolution, this is not what you had in mind. You're looking at the whole idea, how do single cells eventually become people? With everything else in between. And this little moth has to become a hummingbird somehow. And it won't have to do with his color. You see, that's exactly what the textbooks, and I've taught for 20-some years at the college level, the textbooks will use changes of micro-nature, the small things that illustrate change, which I have no argument with. We also call that adaptation, where organisms are variable so that they can adjust to changing environmental conditions. But when you start looking at organisms, can amphibians change into reptiles? Can reptiles change into birds and mammals? Can apes change into people? That's the issue that most people are wondering about, but the examples I used are used to show evolution has to be true. Look, we can demonstrate change. but depends on change in what level. In the macroevolutionary idea, we're looking at the fact that we have no real evidence that organisms can jump from one major group to another major group to another major group, and that's what we're going to talk about next. Biologos is a theistic evolution website on the internet. Francis Collins, who did the human genome studies, these are Christian people, but they are theistic evolutionists. And here's their point regarding the use of small changes to illustrate the big things. Scientists make the confident claim that macroevolution is simply microevolution writ large. Add up enough small changes, and you get large changes. My response is, show me the evidence for the large changes. Because the problem you have is that in order to move from single cells, which have one chromosome, has no instructions for making a heart, may have no instructions for making a mind. How does that bacteria get the genetic information of the cells of a human being? That's what we do not see in the line of evidence. But this is the chart that every student taking geology, taking biology, taking most any other field of science will see, in which you have down here you have the single cells starting 3.5 billion years ago. Then you have the invertebrates, you have the fish, amphibians, reptiles, the dinosaurs, along with birds, and eventually all the plants are evolving with this, and then mammals, and finally at the top of the chart, human beings, especially over the fossil part of it, over a period of about 600 million years. Is that supported by the scientific evidence? Well, that's what we want to look at next. The only direct evidence that there is whether or not that chart is true, I'm talking about direct evidence, would be the fossils. Because the idea is what we see outside is layers of sediments that have been laid down, the assumption, the allegation is, laid down over millions and millions and millions of years. If you cored down through the dirt, went down a long, long ways and could pull that core out, and then you start analyzing the creatures that you see in that core, they will in fact show and reflect what was living all through that period of time. In other words, you have a fossil record in the sedimentary layers of the earth. Let's go and see what we find when we look at those sedimentary layers. This is the field of paleontology that we look at. Let's first affirm that I'm not just telling you that fossils are important. For example, here is a graduate school text on an evolution, and it simply cites, without intermediates or transitional forms to bridge the enormous gaps which separate groups of organisms, the concept of evolution could never be taken seriously as a scientific hypothesis. You see, as you go through that core that we're talking about, you might find some sand dollars, some sea urchins, you might find a variety of invertebrates, and then you find fish. But wait a minute. Invertebrates evolved into fish. So I want to see the transitions from the invertebrates to the vertebrate, the fish. I want to see the pathway. I want to see what I call the wannabes. I want to be a fish, but I'm not quite there yet. And then when we go from the fish to the amphibians, we have to change from gills to lungs to get oxygen. I want to see the transitions between the fish and the amphibians. And after all, isn't that what makes headlines? What makes headlines today are what they call the missing links. In other words, if they find some ape that has a particular characteristic that might seem a little more human-like, it's front page news. Because, oh, once again, they've found the missing link. They're looking for transitions to prove the theory of evolution. And they've got to find those transitions between the major groups to prove that single cells eventually could become people. Let's look. This is a typical tree that you would see that in evolutionary textbooks and in our public school textbooks as well, in which you start with a single cell, branches out into all the plants and animals, and eventually notice that there are people at the top of the tree. I'm interested in the pink lines. Why do you run a pink line from one of those creatures to another, and then to another, to another? Because the pink lines are the transitions I'm talking about. I don't want to find just a horse. I want to find the transitions that got me to the horse. Not just a pink line. The boxes, for example, would be the transitions. I want to see those fossils that are present where the pink lines are. Darwin himself agrees with this premise. The number of intermediates in his Origin of Species, published, the number of intermediates and transitional links between all living and extinct species must have been inconceivably great. So Darwin agrees. In fact, he says, what we see as amphibians, reptiles, mammals, birds, actually should be the least frequent fossils. We should see much more of the intermediates, the transitions, than we see the others, because they're just passing moments in the ongoing evolution. Going back to the chart, where we have the yellow arrows, that's what we're looking for. We want to see what happened in between the major groups, and therefore those would be the proof that evolution actually occurred. Let's take a look, starting with the invertebrates and moving up that chart. One of the major unsolved problems of geology and evolution is the occurrence of diversified, multicellular marine invertebrates in lower Cambrian rocks. Lower Cambrian means 600 million years ago, on all the continents, and their absence in rocks of greater age. In other words, all of paleontology agrees that the invertebrates that show up in the sediment layers of 600 million years ago, assuming the age. I personally don't, but I have to use that to talk about what they talk about. What they would say is 600 million years ago, we had all the invertebrates show up, but they had no ancestors. In other words, they came out of nowhere. There were no transitions from the single cell to the multi-cell invertebrates. If you see what I'm looking at there on the chart, what you're seeing there is the fact that this is today, this up here is 600 million years ago. And notice that some of these invertebrates have been the same for 600 million years if we accepted geological concepts of age. They haven't changed at all. There's a few that are extinct. These are just examples. But there are no wannabes have ever been found. In other words, every invertebrate that has ever been found is complete, functional, working. It's not kind of getting there. In other words, no ancestors, know where they came from. In fact, one of the big issues in biology is what they call evolution's Big Bang. How in the world, and of course they use 10 million years, within a span of no more than 10 million years, in comparison to 600 million, that's like nothing. Creatures with teeth and tentacles and claws and jaws materialized with the suddenness of apparitions. Nature appears to have sketched out the blueprints of virtually the whole of the animal kingdom all at once. Oops. That's not Darwinian. It's supposed to start with single cells, and over millions of years they keep changing, millions and millions and millions, and they get more and more diversified, more and more complete as time goes on. But the actual fossil record, and this is published, this was in Time magazine, it's everywhere in places. When life exploded, what does that sound more like than evolution? It sounds like creation. It sounds like the point at which God placed life on the planet. And here's Richard Dawkins, the famous evolutionist. It's as though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history. And all of us say, amen. You see, they can get that close to seeing the evidence that paleontology gives to us, but they completely reject it and say, but even though it looks like that, it can't be. You see, the dilemma I do elsewhere in my studies is I look at what happens once you've eliminated God from reality. Now you can go anywhere your mind or imagination wants to take you because you now have no restrictions of authority and absolute nature. And that's what happened here. Once you eliminate God, you now have to come up with some other way to get things. And evolution is that way. Let's move up to the area that invertebrates have to become fish. Can we find any wannabes between the two? Now understand that this is a very fast overview, and there would be discussion and debate between scientists of whether there are candidates who would be in between or in intermediates. But this is one that has been proposed, a fish called coelacanth. It's been extinct, we were told, for about 60 to 65 million years. And when they look at the bones, which is all you get when you find fossils, it looked like the fins on the bottom of the fish were elongated. Ah, here is a fish that's growing legs in order to be able to come out of the water and walk on land. And that was the intermediate that was proposed between the fish and the amphibians until a fisherman some years ago was fishing off the coast of Africa around the area of Madagascar, and he pulled one of these things up from the water. He caught a coelacanth, a live one, but I thought they were extinct for 65 million years. Evidently not. Now they've caught many coelacanth. And when they look at the live coelacanth with the flesh on it, not just the bones, turns out the fins aren't legs at all. Nor are they growing lungs, which would require a completely set of genetic blueprint information. Where are they going to get that from? To substitute lungs for gills. Coelacanth has now dropped off of the wannabes list, and no replacements are there for that transition. Here's the late Stephen Gould, Harvard University. All paleontologists know that the fossil record contains precious little in the way of intermediate forms. Transitions between major groups are characteristically abrupt. You're looking at your transition thing here, and all of a sudden you go from fish. Oops, the next thing you find are amphibians. Nothing in between. That's what he means. You go abruptly from fish to amphibians with nothing in between. There are no transitions between the two. How do we get from the reptiles to the birds? Because that's the evolutionary position. Reptiles eventually gave rise to the birds and to the mammals. Archaeopteryx is your answer. You perhaps have heard of this. It's considered by some as an evolutionary intermediate form between reptiles and birds. Why? Because it has the reptilian characteristics of scales, and it has teeth, but it has feathers. There you go. Clearly an intermediate between reptiles and birds. But wait a minute. How did feathers arise in the evolutionary theory? From scales. Scales over millions of years kept changing until they became feathers. And that took millions and millions of years of transition. I want to find a fossil that has a scather. Do you see what I mean? The difference here. Because just because you have an organism that has some characteristics of one group and the characteristics of the other group, what you want to look at are the characteristics fully developed and mature? Or are they transitional characteristics? In this case, we have strictly a bird with some characteristics of birds, and we have some characteristics of reptiles, and we call those in biology a mosaic. It's a mosaic. You say, what's that? Well, just exactly what I said. It has a mix of characteristics from two different groups, but they're not evolutionary transitions because the characteristics show no evidence of transformation. They are fully developed in the same creature, like this. Here's a duck-billed platypus. It has fur like a mammal. lays eggs like a bird. Why don't evolutionists say that the duck-billed platypus must be a transition between birds and mammals? Because it has some characteristics of both. Because in the theory, birds don't evolve into mammals. So we don't need it. We call it a mosaic. Archaeopteryx is exactly the same thing. It's a mosaic having completed and functional characteristics, not transitional characteristics between two groups. Gould again. The extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. What I'm telling you now in this portion of the presentation, would that be the impression you would get from the news media as this is played out in everyday life? No. The presentation you'll get from the news media, because all you're hearing is each new find that makes headlines about missing links. And that fossils clearly are showing that evolution is true. But they never put on the front page when the find has been demonstrated not to be what it was originally presented as. That doesn't make news. So all you ever get is the news that fossils are supporting evolution, never the news that fossils disprove evolution. The evolutionary trees, remember that tree that I showed you starting with the cell and branches off into the plants and the animals, that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of the branches. Wait a minute, do you get that? What Gould is saying is that, yeah, there are horses. Yes, there's Archaeopteryx. Yes, there's flowering plants. Yes, there are apes. That's right. That's the tips and nodes of the branches. But there aren't any fossils for the pink lines that connect them. Therefore, why do we put the lines in there if there's no evidence for the lines? Because it wouldn't look like evolution if you didn't have the lines in there. The fossil record has failed to reveal the fossil intermediates between major life groups predicted by evolution. We would probably want to say then that macroevolution, the idea that you have single cells evolving over millions and millions of years to become eventually everything else. Remember when we started the worldview? In the beginning, matter. And eventually you have to get life, you have to get people and minds, and macroevolution does not demonstrate that starting from matter with chance alone that you're going to get there at all. What scientific basis is there for connecting the plants and animals with pink lines? If you look on page 18 in your book, you'll see what that tree looks like without the pink lines. Does that look like evolution? No, it doesn't. You see, only the things you see on page 18 are the result of scientific evidence. The pink lines are not supported by scientific evidence. But it's only the pink lines that connect the dots and make it look like it. We paleontologists, these are evolutionists, folks. We paleontologists have said that the history of life supports the story of gradual adaptive change. You're going from the simple to the complex. You're going to develop minds. You're going to develop, all the creatures we see on the face of the earth in a gradual way, all the while knowing that it does not. Do you think that would make front page of the news? No, that's all that they say between each other. Paleontologists know there are no transitions between the major groups, but that's exactly what's being taught in our public schools and in every major university around the world. Unless they have a commitment to the biblical worldview. In the beginning, God. It's the only way you're going to end up differently. So the summary of the fossil record is this. Consistent pattern of sudden appearance followed by stasis. That means when they look in the fossil record, they see the appearance of organisms without any ancestors. We don't know where they came from. They appear suddenly in the fossil record, And when we find them in the fossil record, we find that they don't change. The ones we find from down here are the same as the ones we find up here in this column. Life's history is more a story of variation around a set of basic designs rather than of accumulating improvement. You see, evolution says we keep getting better and better, we keep getting more and more, and little by little we become what we are today. Fossil record says no. Remember the biological explosion? The Big Bang? The biological Big Bang. It started with all of the basic life patterns and designs right from the start. And all we have is, as we go through the fossil record, is variation on those basic designs. Extinction, Darwin said, would be also very gradual because it takes time for natural selection to sort out those that are disadvantaged in the environment, and the ones that survive then would be a very, very slow process over millions of years. What we find out is almost all of extinction is catastrophic. Extinction occurred, boom, all of a sudden, not gradual at all. It doesn't fit what evolution would predict. And then evolutionary interpretations of the fossil record owe more to Darwinist preconception than to the evidence itself. God said, "It is I who made the earth and created man upon it. I stretched out the heavens with my hands. I ordained all their host. For by him," New Testament, "all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things were created by him and for him." A little different perspective, would you not say? Than what I've been showing you is alleged in the evolutionary position. We need to go back to the very foundational level. What about God himself? And if God exists, then the evolutionary worldview cannot be used and applied. In the Bible, in Paul in Romans chapter 1, verses 18 to 20, that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power, and his divine nature have been clearly seen. How? Being understood through what has been made, so that they are, say it with me, without excuse. No one is going to be able to stand before God someday as an atheist, as an agnostic, as a skeptic, and say, "How could have I known?" And God will tell them, "Because I left my fingerprints all over the world that I created." Without excuse to deny the existence of God. In our next session, we're going to look at the evidence for creation. We're going to be looking at two powerful things that have come up now in the last couple decades: intelligent design and irreducible complexity. Sounds like big words, but you're going to love this evidence that comes out of science, which once again supports the fact that God revealed himself through the world which he has made.